As we have our Bibles open to Mark chapter 14, this passage, we're jumping right in the middle of the Gospel of Mark towards the end, and it is really close to the time that Jesus is going to be betrayed. In fact, several passages leading up to this passage in Mark 14, Mark writes and he tells us that Jesus purposefully communicated to the disciples, hey, I'm here to die. I'm going to die on the cross soon. I'm going to be gone a little while, and I'm going to be gone. And he tells them that, but the disciples are distracted. They don't really get it. He tells them over and over and over that the mission that Jesus Christ is on, he says, the mission I'm on is a mission to suffer. And the disciples just don't really get it. And then we come to Mark 14, verse 1. It was now 2 days before the Passover and the feast of unleavened bread. And the chief priests and scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth in secret and kill him. For they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. What does that mean? So Jerusalem was only place where Passover could be celebrated. And during this week, Jerusalem would be packed full of people from all over. And we know from reading the Gospel of Mark before this passage that Jesus traveled all over and taught. He traveled all over and healed. And I'll tell you what, there was people packing out Jerusalem right now for this feast, beginning to pile in. And the chief priests and scribes are like, okay, this guy's a renegade. We need to do something about him. We need to find a way that we need to just X this guy off the map, if you know what I mean. But we can't do it during the feast because a lot of these people, he healed their relatives. He cured the blind. He caused the blind to see. Some of them even saw him walk on water. If they know that we killed him, there's going to be a big uproar. So it can't happen sometime during that week, that feast of Passover. That was in Jerusalem. Look at verse 3 now. While he was at Bethany, that's close by, in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at a table. They didn't have lazy boys back then. Back then, the table was smaller, shorter to the ground, and they would lay on their sides reclining, and that's how they would eat. So when he says, as he was reclining at the table, now we like to recline after we eat. They did it while they eat. So he was reclining at the table, he was eating. The culture at this time, when people are invited to eat, typically the men ate first. And you only ate with somebody like this, especially somebody dignified, somebody important, which a lot of people consider Jesus important for a good cause, right? However, basically this meal was VIP only. You had to show your VIP pass to get in. These were the people that were closest to Jesus here. As he was reclining at the table, that tells us a couple things. This is a very important dinner right there with Jesus. It's basically by invitation only, and it tells us the meal has already started. It doesn't say before he was reclining, it says as he was reclining at the table. The meal already started. If you were invited, you showed up. If you weren't there, you weren't invited. It was VIP pass. So it's very rare what's about to happen. As he was reclining at the table, in the middle of the meal, a woman came. You don't just show up in the middle of a meal. You don't barge into some place where you're not invited to and interrupt the meal like this in this culture. See, if we're not careful, we can miss that stuff when we just read it. Okay, you got to understand. This woman that came in had no care for cultural statuses of the day at all. This woman came in the middle of the meal, interrupted, with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. Now, there's repetition in this. Verse 3. While he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, he was reclining at the table. Got it. They were eating. Woman came in with an alabaster flask. Got it. She's late to the party, but she comes in with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard very costly, and broke it. Notice all the way it describes that object there. There's more attention given to the object than the person. It's just called a woman. You have to go to John's gospel to figure out it's Mary. Not Mary, his mother, the other Mary. One of the other Marys. We'll get to that. But why does the scripture use this repetition? This alabaster flask of ointment, of pure nard, very costly. What's the purpose of that? You see, this was very costly. This flask of ointment was worth about a year's wages. About a year's wages. In Mark 16:37, 200 denarii was seen to be adequate to feed 5,000 people. Later, that says here that this flask could have been sold for more than 300. What does that mean to us? It means, imagine working for an entire calendar year, not buying a single thing, not doing anything with it, only working for an entire calendar year, putting that money in a bank account, or having that maybe already, and buying one gift. And then look what she does. This is probably a family heirloom, but this is remarkable right here. There's so much in this passage. With an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask. Hang on. If you have something that's worth a lot, you don't want to break it. Wow. Pretty fascinating what happens. When she broke the flask, that was irrevocable. It's broke. You can't get a new tire and throw it on and keep driving it. No, that's not how this flask works. You have something very costly, costs a year's wages, and she breaks it in front of everybody. So it doesn't matter what she was about to do with the ointment right now. At the point that where she even walked in, everybody's thinking, what's going on here? Who are you? I don't know if you saw we're eating. You're not really supposed to be here. You weren't invited. You don't understand. We're the disciples of Jesus. We're like super important right here, okay? What was your name? Larry? Barry? Oh, Mary. Okay. Guard, come here. Servant, come here. Could you show Miss Larry here on her way out? That's basically probably what the feeling in the room was at this time. This was completely, this was preposterous that anything like this would even happen. She was reclining. They broke the flask. She already had everybody's attention by barging in the middle of the meal. And then she breaks a flask. Already people are thinking, what are you doing? And then she poured it over Jesus' head. This gift that she gives Jesus was very costly. It was irrevocable. It was abundant. She poured the entire jar on Jesus. You can look at other Gospels accounts of this same story that really happened, and he goes on that she anointed his head and anointed his feet and wiped it with her hair. She did this without hesitation. This was an urgent gift. She couldn't wait until, you don't understand. I wonder how many people, listen, everywhere Jesus went, people thronged him. How many people did she have to say, excuse me, pardon me, to try to get through, to even get to Jesus, and then barge in the door? This was urgent that she did it. She wasn't hesitant about it. The fact that she interrupts the meal shows it was urgent. She had her mind made up. There is nobody that can stop her from doing what she's doing. But people weren't happy about it. Jesus is having this meal. This woman walks in uninvited to the VIP party, discussing some very spiritual stuff with Jesus, no doubt. Woman comes in, nobody can tell her no, breaks something super expensive, worth a year's wages, about $50,000, $50,000 to $70,000 or $35,000, whatever a year's wages is. Of course, it varies by part of the country, but very expensive. She has everybody's attention. And what does she do with that attention? When she pours the flask all on Jesus, she puts all the attention on Jesus right there. Mark doesn't even give her name. In Mark, she's an anonymous woman. Look what the disciples said in verse 4. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, "Why was this ointment wasted like that?" Oh, not good. "For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they scolded her. This reaction here. See, the disciples at this time saw what was going on. They overlooked the other minor things she did wrong to focus on the big things she did wrong. In their eyes, she did wrong. The disciples demeaned the woman. "Why did you do that? Pouring that whole jar on Jesus, that's a waste." What did they do? They didn't just demean her, they demeaned Jesus. They're saying Jesus is not worthy of that expensive of a gift. That's exactly what they're saying. These disciples are not just rebuking the woman here, they are demeaning Jesus. It's a waste to give Jesus all that. What? Think of what they're saying there. Unbelievable. They protest. To honor Christ like that is a waste. That's a waste. And yet Mary was willing to pour her possessions to be rich in devotion to Jesus. She was willing to be poor in possessions, to be rich in her devotion to Jesus. How do you think Jesus is there? He hasn't said a word at this point. He was reclining at the table. Woman came in, broke the flask, poured it on him. Disciples are outraged. "What are you doing? We could have sold that for 300. That's a year's wages. That's a waste to waste it like that." Jesus is just taking it all in. Look what he says. Verse 6. "But Jesus said, 'Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her.'" So what happens here? Jesus rebukes the protesting disciples and praises the woman for what she did. And then you read verse 10 and 11. It kind of seems disjointed and out of place. Look at verse 10. "Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, he was there, went to the chief priests in order to betray him. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. He sought an opportunity to betray him." Now, upon reading this passage, verses 1 through 11, it all goes together, yet when you read it, it almost kind of reads disjointed. Okay, first the chief priests and scribes are looking to capture Jesus, but they can't do it right now. And then we see Mary, and then it goes back to Judas, who actually goes back to the chief priests and scribes and agrees. Okay, so you're starting to see it tie together a little bit. So what's this passage about? It almost seems kind of choppy. First day of Passover, chief priests, scribes, this unnamed woman, disciples speak up, then there's Judas. Why does this passage read so choppy? Is it just about the gift? Look at verse 7 and 8. This is the clue. Jesus provides the reason why this passage is in the Bible. Verse 7 and 8. He says, "For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me." Hang on a second. Remember, Jesus has been trying to communicate something to his disciples. We're going to go back and see it in a minute. He's been trying to tell them, listen, I'm going to go to the cross. Listen, I'm going to die soon. And he's saying, listen, you guys don't get it. You don't get what's about to happen, but she does. She's anointed my body for burial. You see, she knows that my mission is not to set up my kingdom right now. My mission is to die and set up the kingdom in heaven. and paved the way for that. She's done what she could. She's anointed my body beforehand for burial. You see, Mark records Jesus telling the disciples 3 times before this that he's going to die. Let's look at a couple passages. This is really going to bring it to light. Stick with me here. Mark 8. Mark 8. We're going to stay in this book. Mark 8. Mark is writing this on purpose. He's spending time including that story, and he writes it the way he does on purpose. Mark 8, verse 31. Look what happens. Jesus is teaching his disciples. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. Jesus is telling the disciples, listen, I'm going to die. The chief priests, the scribes, they're going to capture me. They're going to put me on a cross, but after 3 days, I'm going to rise again. Look what Peter said in response. Verse 32, and he said this plainly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. You think Peter was having anything with the suffering mission of Jesus? Oh, no. Jesus, I don't know what you're talking about. We're going to defend you. I have my sword. I brought it. But turning to see his disciples, he rebuked Peter. He said, get behind me, Satan. Jesus is trying to tell his disciples, my mission is to suffer. Look at Mark 9:31 now, one chapter over, 9:31. Mark chapter 9, verse 31. For he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. But when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise. What's he doing? Telling them about his mission. My mission is to suffer. Listen. Verse 32. But they did not understand the saying and were afraid to ask him. Look at the next verse. Why were they distracted? They were distracted. They didn't understand why. And they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, oh, what were you guys discussing? Jesus asked the disciples. Remember when I was trying to tell you guys about my mission to go die on the cross and suffer, and I'm going to die, and 3 days later I'm going to rise again? Yeah, I don't think you guys understood me because you were discussing something. You seemed distracted. What were you guys talking about? But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. Nobody confessed to that one. Next question, Jesus. Mark 10, verse 33 now. They were arguing over who's the greatest disciple. Mark 10:33. Mark's putting all this on purpose. He's leading up to that story. Mark 10:33. Jesus foretells his death and resurrection the third time. He was teaching the 12, saying, see, we go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. That means Jewish people can't crucify people, but Romans can. And that's what he was saying. He was saying, I'm not going to be put to death by the Jews. The Jews are going to betray me and put me to death, and they're going to turn me over to the Romans, and they're going to put me to death. Crucifixion was a Roman thing, not a Jewish thing. That's what he says, deliver him into the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days, he will rise. Boy, wouldn't you like to have been here, hearing Jesus talk about foretelling his own death and resurrection? Look what's happening there. Do you think the disciples got it there? Next verse. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him and said to him, Teacher, we want you to do this for us, whatever we ask of you. He said, okay, what is it? What do you want me to do for you? Verse 37. And they asked, grant us one to sit on your right hand and the other to sit on your left in your glory. This is cringeworthy right here. And then we come to Mark 14 with our text. This woman understands that Jesus was sent on a mission to die on the cross and to resurrect 3 days later. And the disciples don't get it at all. They missed it again. Well, this is a waste. Why did you do that? Jesus is saying, you guys have been missing it. This woman here understands that I have been sent to die. She knows that my mission is to suffer. You guys are too worried about your own self, about looking great. But this is a VIP meeting. This ain't no VIP meeting. We're talking about spiritual stuff. Who's going to be the greatest? We know he's going to answer it. He heard the question, but he hasn't answered. That's what we're listening for. There's no doubt that's what they were listening for here. They were waiting. Who's going to be the greatest? What does this mean to us? It means that Jesus has not called you to be great. He's called you to make a great sacrifice for him. Jesus came to make the greatest sacrifice for all mankind. And your response to that, my response to that, our response to that should not be, make us great. Oh, you're going to be just like the disciples then. You're going to miss it. Jesus has not called you to be great. Be great for Jesus. No, be low for Jesus. Jesus took upon himself the form of a servant and came in the likeness of man to suffer. And the disciples missed it because they wanted to be seen talking to Jesus. They wanted to be seen, he's the Messiah. We're going to go down in history as his disciples. And when he sits on his throne, we're probably all going to be around here, and people are going to look at them and be like, whoa, those guys must be spiritual. And Mark leaves this woman unnamed on purpose to say, it's not about her name. It's not about her at all. All throughout the time when Jesus was telling his disciples he's going to be betrayed, every single time, that's not going to happen. We're going to rebuke you. Oh, I don't know about that one. Who's going to be the greatest? He's going to answer. Let us sit on your right hand and on your left. We want to be the closest to you, Jesus. We want everybody to see you, yes, but we want everybody to see me beside you. Judas is the bad guy in this passage. Yes, he betrays Jesus. But he's not the only bad guy in this passage. Mark is making an example about all of the disciples. They could not embrace the suffering mission of Jesus because they were worried about their own greatness. And this unnamed woman is the only one who gets it. She's the only one who gets that the sacrifice of Jesus should prompt us to be sacrificial in worship in return. She's the only one that gets it. You see, following Jesus is not about being visible. This unnamed woman is the only one who gets it. She gets one verse in this passage. Just verse 3 is the only one where she's even talked about. Besides when Jesus talks about her. But her actions, she only gets one verse. It's not about being visible. Following Jesus is not about being visible. Following Jesus is not about being great. Following Jesus is not about being known. Following Jesus is not about being looked at as a respectable teacher. Following Jesus is about taking up your cross and embracing his suffering mission by making sacrificial worship from your heart and having that sacrifice show up in your life in response. This week, this is kind of funny. This week I read about a church that was in need of furniture. This church was in need of furniture, and this particularly, it was a very large church. Still is a large church. It was particularly their student ministry building that needed furniture. And so the congregation responded to this need. The need was presented to the congregation, and the congregation responded. And many went out in the congregation and bought new couches for their homes. And they donated their old couches to the church. You see, they deemed the couches no longer worthy of being there in their own home, but they were good enough for Jesus. They were thrilled about the opportunity to meet a need in the church. They felt like they did a noble thing. They met a need in the church, and they got to enjoy new furniture in their homes, and they even got a tax break. How is that not a good deal, right? But very soon, the student ministries building in this church was filled with old, ratty, stained couches. I was told that each one had their own unique scent. There was a big problem. There's always a problem when you put Jesus second. Always. See, these disciples here were thinking, Jesus, you're number 2 on my list. That's a pretty high priority. I mean, a lot of people, Jesus isn't even on their list. He's number 2 on mine. They're feeling pretty good about themselves. I mean, hey, when you be seen, I'm going to be seen with you. They were really cared more about themselves than they did Jesus. And Mark is telling us here that if Jesus is second in your life, you are failing to embrace the suffering mission of Jesus. Because if you embrace the suffering mission of Jesus, because if you embrace the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, you will embrace the chance to make a sacrifice for him and worship him. That's what this unnamed woman did. The disciples thought they were important. It was an exclusive VIP meeting. Show us your VIP pass. Very important people is what that means, you know. And the disciples' view of greatness is to have a great status, to be admired by other people. But the heavenly view of greatness is great sacrifice. Great sacrifice. This passage is a striking contrast between this woman who gave this extravagant gift, irrevocable, because she knew, because Jesus was coming to die for her sins, she knew there was nothing that she could give Jesus that was too much. There was nothing off the charts. Nothing. And it's a contrast between a woman who was willing to be poor in possessions to be great in sacrifice, and really Judas at the end here. The disciples, we can be hard on them too, a little bit. But Judas especially. Here's this woman making this sacrifice for Christ, and here's Judas. Look at that. Verse 10. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray them to him. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him what? Money. See, he was willing to betray Jesus in order to get. While this woman's response in worship, she understood what Jesus was doing, so she was willing to make a sacrifice for Jesus. What a contrast between those two. It's not a mistake. It reads that way on purpose. It's not choppy. They go together. Mark is making a contrast. That those who embrace the suffering mission of Christ will be changed by it, and they will embrace making sacrifices themselves. Has God ever prompted you to, I'm not just saying if you've done anything significant, has God ever prompted you to make a sacrifice, to do something that is truly sacrificial in nature? Something where other people, if they heard you did it or gave it or whatever, would think you're crazy. If you're here today, there's one thing you need to know about Jesus Christ. The disciples had a hard time with it, but this woman gets it. It's that Jesus Christ came to suffer and sacrifice himself on the cross and raise again 3 days later. Jesus embraced suffering to bring you victory and to forgive your sin. And there is a God in heaven who knows everything about you. He knows the good, the bad, and the ugly. He knows the thoughts and intents of the heart, as evidence in this passage. Remember, they said within themselves, yeah, God knows. And yet, he loves you anyway. And Jesus Christ embraced the suffering, the bloodshed, the betrayal, and the death on the cross. But Jesus Christ also rose from the dead to give you victory and forgiveness. You see, the only real way to victory is sacrifice. You cannot have victory without embracing Christ's sacrifice. You can't have your sins forgiven without embracing Christ's sacrifice. And you're going to have a really hard time trying to make a sacrificial worship if you don't embrace Christ's sacrifice and understand what he has come to do. Jesus Christ embraced suffering for you so he can forgive your sin and so you can have a relationship with God. And anybody who understands the suffering mission of Jesus will embrace opportunities to sacrifice for Jesus. You want to know where the real joy in the Christian life is? It's not in being blessed. It's so true that it is better to give than to receive. True joy in the Christian life is worshiping God, knowing that that worship cost you something. To give God sacrificial worship. The disciples were not happy. Judas was not happy. Jesus was happy. And this woman had joy in her heart as she worshiped Jesus sacrificially. I want to encourage you today, embrace the joy that comes with sacrificial worship.